He hadn't heard that sound in 6 months, not even once. The sound of laughter, the sound of life, the sound of hope. Then, on an ordinary morning inside the Morrison mansion, he heard it again. A faint giggle, a whisper, a word. Anthony Morrison, billionaire, widower and father of 2, froze in the middle of the marble hallway. It was the same hallway where Silence had lived since the day she left. He turned slowly, his heart pounding like thunder trapped inside his chest. From upstairs came the soft voices of his twins, 2 boys who hadn't spoken a single word since birth. And when he finally heard what they said, it shattered him completely, because their very first word was her name. Before that day, the Morrison mansion stood high above the peaceful city of Charleston, South Carolina, a glass fortress of wealth that overlooked the Atlantic coast. To the outside world, it was the home of a man who had everything: money, power, legacy, but inside those walls lived nothing but echoes and grief. People called Anthony Morrison the man who could buy anything, but the one thing he couldn't buy was sound, not the laughter of his sons, not the voice of the woman who once brought warmth back into their lives, not even peace. 6 months earlier, after a misunderstanding that cut deeper than either of them realized, Mary Jackson, the maid who had taught his paralyzed twins how to feel, had walked out of his life. No argument, no final word, just the sound of her footsteps fading down the marble stairs. Since then, Anthony had counted every sunrise in silence, and sometimes silence is louder than thunder. The Morrison mansion stood like a sleeping cathedral above Charleston, its windows dim, its halls still. Not even the wind dared to whisper through the open balcony doors. Inside, Anthony sat in the twins' nursery. The walls were painted pale blue, scattered with faded stars and half-broken toys. Daniel and David, his 6-year-old twin boys, were curled on the floor beside each other, tracing lines on the carpet with crayons but saying nothing. Once Mary's laughter had filled this room. Once her soft singing had coaxed the boys to sleep when even lullabies failed. But now the air felt heavy, as if the house itself had forgotten how to breathe. Anthony leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. He had hired the best doctors in Charleston, flown in specialists from New York, paid for technology that promised breakthroughs. But nothing worked. The boys didn't speak, didn't try, didn't look at him the same way they used to. He reached for the tablet on the table and tapped play. A video flickered to life, grainy, old, recorded in warmer days. Mary's voice drifted out of the speaker. "Come on, little ones, one step at a time." On screen, the twins giggled, small, bright, unguarded laughter. The sound pierced through the silence like sunlight through a storm cloud. Anthony's throat tightened. He paused the video halfway, staring at Mary's face frozen on the screen. Her smile wide, her eyes gentle. It wasn't just the smile of an employee. It was the kind of smile that healed. He whispered under his breath, "Where are you, Mary?" Behind him, Daniel let out a soft noise, half a breath, half a sigh. Anthony turned sharply, heart thudding. For a split second he thought his son had spoken, but the boy was only reaching for a toy car. The silence fell again. That night, rain gathered over Charleston. The sky darkened, lightning flashing far beyond the harbor. Anthony stood by the window, watching drops race down the glass, like tears he couldn't shed. On his desk sat an unopened stack of reports and a framed photograph, Mary smiling, arms wrapped around the twins. It was the last picture taken before she left. The housekeeper knocked softly. "Sir, dinner is ready." He didn't turn around. "I'm not hungry." When the door closed again, the emptiness returned. Anthony sat in his chair, eyes distant, hands clasped. He had built companies, conquered markets, controlled empires, but he couldn't control this silence. He rubbed his temples, whispering to no one. They were better when she was here. Then something caught his eye. A small box on the bookshelf had fallen, its lid slightly open. He knelt to pick it up and found a folded envelope wedged behind it, covered in dust. His name was written across it in soft cursive. He froze. He knew that handwriting. Mary. He tore it open carefully. Inside was a small piece of paper. They will speak when they feel safe again. M. He read it once, twice, a third time. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He sank into the chair, holding the note against his chest, the sound of rain washing softly against the window pane. For the first time in 6 months, he closed his eyes and let himself cry. And outside, as thunder rolled above the quiet city of Charleston, the storm whispered through the night, the same melody Mary used to hum when the twins couldn't sleep. He didn't know it yet, but that storm was about to bring something back, something he thought he'd lost forever. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Tell us in the comments what moment moved you the most, because your words might give someone else the strength to believe again. And if you believe kindness still matters, tap subscribe, hit like, and share this story with someone who still believes in hope, faith, and second chances. The storm had passed by morning, but the mansion still carried its weight, the scent of rain, the chill of damp marble, and the lingering echo of thunder that seemed to hum through the air like a ghost. Anthony Morrison stood by the tall windows, the city of Charleston shimmering faintly below under a silver dawn. The world outside looked fresh and new, washed clean, but inside he felt nothing but ruin. He still held the note. The paper had curled from the humidity of his palms, but the words refused to fade. They will speak when they feel safe again. He repeated it in his mind like a prayer over and over, as if saying it enough times might bring her back, safe again. What had he done that made her, and them, feel unsafe? He moved through the halls, slow and heavy, each step echoing like a confession. He paused at the twins' door. They were still asleep, curled beside each other, tiny breaths rising and falling in the morning light. For a moment, he just watched them, fragile, innocent, unaware that the silence inside them had become his punishment. He turned away. Downstairs, the housekeeper was setting the breakfast table. Silver trays, folded napkins, untouched plates. She looked up as he entered. "Good morning, sir." He gave a faint nod. "Morning." Then his eyes fell on the far end of the dining room, the place where Mary used to stand every morning, waiting quietly for instructions that never came. He could almost see her there again, her hands clasped, her head slightly tilted, that gentle, understanding look she always carried. He blinked, and she was gone. He sat at the table but couldn't eat. The eggs cooled, the coffee went bitter, and the housekeeper watched him in silence, afraid to disturb the thoughts building behind his blank stare. Finally she spoke. "Sir, the children used to laugh more when Miss Mary was around." Anthony's hand froze on the coffee cup. "I know. They miss her, we all do." He said nothing. He just looked down at the note again, safe again. The words stung. He rose abruptly, pushing the chair back. "I'm going out." "Where to, sir?" "I don't know." And with that, he walked out into the Charleston morning, the air thick with the smell of wet magnolia trees and the promise of another storm. Later that day, Anthony found himself driving aimlessly through the quiet
car's
streets
wipers
downtown.
squeaked
Softly, as a light drizzle began again, the kind that blurs streetlights into gold halos. He passed the old market square, the children's park where Mary once took the twins for air, the coffee shop she'd loved on her rare mornings off. Everything reminded him of her. Every corner held a ghost. At a red light, he closed his eyes and leaned back, the sound of rain tapping gently on the windshield. He remembered the night she left, that argument. He'd been tired, angry, frustrated that the twins hadn't progressed fast enough despite everything he paid for. She had stood there quietly, tears in her eyes, and said, "Mr. Morrison, they don't need another doctor. They need peace." And he'd shouted back, "What they need is someone who knows what they're doing." Then she'd taken off her apron, placed it on the table, and whispered, "Maybe what you need is to listen." He never did, until now. The light turned green. He didn't move. Cars behind him honked, but he just sat there, hands trembling on the steering wheel. "I was wrong," he muttered. "Mary, I was wrong." He finally drove off, not toward home, but toward the old part of Charleston. the district of small houses, narrow streets and quiet churches. It was the kind of place Mary once mentioned she volunteered on weekends. He stopped outside St. Anne's Community Centre, a weathered brick building with peeling paint. Through the window he saw children, some in wheelchairs, some drawing with crayons. A volunteer was reading them a story. For a second his heart leapt. He thought it was her. He got out of the car, walked closer, and realized it wasn't. Just another woman with kind eyes. Still, the sight pierced him. He stepped back, leaning against the car. The drizzle became rain again. He whispered, "Where did you go, Mary?" Back home, the mansion was dark except for the faint light in the twins' room. Anthony stood outside their door, listening. They were awake, whispering little sounds, trying to form words that wouldn't come. He could hear the effort in their breathing, the small frustration in their sighs. He wanted to help. He wanted to fix it. But every time he stepped closer, they went quiet. He understood why. He was part of the silence now. He walked to his study, poured a glass of wine and sat before the large fireplace. The flames flickered against the framed photograph on the mantel. Mary's smile, forever frozen between warmth and goodbye. He opened his phone, scrolled through old text messages. The last one from her still unread. "Thank you for trusting me with them." He had never replied. He tapped on the keyboard, typed a message, deleted it, typed again, deleted again. How do you apologize to someone who gave you everything you didn't know you needed? He set the phone down and buried his face in his hands. "Please, come back." The only answer was the crackle of the fire. Outside, Charleston slept. The storm clouds drifted toward the sea, leaving the air clear and heavy with memory. Inside the mansion, Anthony closed his eyes and heard her voice again, faint, like an echo wrapped in warmth. They will speak when they feel safe again. He looked toward the twins' room, his heart aching. "Then I'll make it safe," he whispered. "I'll make it right." And as the fire dimmed, that promise became the first honest thing he'd said in years. The next morning, Charleston woke to the smell of salt and sunlight. After 2 days of storm, the air was fresh again, clear, quiet, forgiving. But inside the Morrison mansion, Anthony sat in his study. The small note from Mary spread across the desk like a relic. He had read it so many times that the edges were starting to curl. His coffee sat untouched beside him, gone cold hours ago. They will speak when they feel safe again. He whispered the words out loud, again and again, as if repeating them could make them make sense. Safe. It wasn't safety of walls or locks or security systems. It was safety of the heart. He leaned back, eyes distant, watching the sun crawl across the blinds. His mind drifted to all the moments he'd misunderstood her, the times he'd mistaken her silence for defiance, her gentleness for weakness. And then he saw it. Right there in front of him, between the stacks of reports and therapy notes, a thin file folder with Mary's handwriting on it. He hadn't noticed it before. The label read, "Progress Journal, Daniel David." He opened it. Inside were pages filled with neat handwriting, her handwriting. Each line documented tiny victories. Daniel responded to music therapy for 10 seconds longer today. David smiled when I hummed the morning song. Both twins turned their heads when they heard laughter. Each note was a drop of love disguised as professionalism. And then, at the very bottom of the final page, one line was underlined twice. "When they trust, they'll speak." Anthony exhaled sharply. The realization hit him like sunlight through stained glass. It wasn't their bodies that were paralyzed, it was their spirits. They had learned fear, not of the world, but of losing it again. He had made them believe love could vanish overnight, just like Mary did. And suddenly the problem wasn't theirs, it was his. He stood, grabbed his coat, and left the mansion. The air outside was warm and alive, seagulls circling the coast. He drove with no destination, just instinct. The letter sitting on the passenger seat beside him like a map. Charleston stretched before him. Cobblestone streets, oak trees draped with Spanish moss, sunlight dancing on puddles left by the rain. It was a city that carried memory in its wind. He drove past familiar places, the bakery where Mary once bought cookies for the twins, the bookstore where she used to pick up picture books, the little park bench near the waterfront where she'd sit with them every Saturday. Every turn whispered her presence. Every face in the crowd looked a little like hers until he blinked. He slowed near the waterfront, where vendors were setting up for the morning market. The scent of roasted coffee and salt water filled the air. He parked the car and stepped out, scanning the street, half hoping, half fearing he'd see her walking there. He didn't. But as he passed a small cafe, a familiar sound caught his ear, a voice humming softly. It was the same lullaby Mary used to sing. He froze, turned toward the sound, heart pounding. Through the open door of the cafe, a woman was wiping tables and humming quietly to herself. For a second his breath caught. Then she turned. It wasn't her. Still, something made him walk in. "Excuse me," he said softly. "That song you're humming, where did you learn it?" The woman smiled, confused. "Oh, that. There's a lady who works at the St. Clair's Therapy Center downtown. She teaches it to the kids there. Said it helps them calm down. Sweetest woman you'll ever meet." Anthony's pulse quickened. "Do you know her name?" The woman tilted her head, trying to remember. "I think it's Mary, yeah. Miss Mary Jackson." He didn't even say thank you. He was already gone. 2 hours later. The car came to a stop in front of a modest, 2-story brick building tucked between an old church and a grocery store. A faded sign read, "St. Clair's Child Therapy Care Center." He stepped out, his heart pounding harder with every step he took. The place was alive with the sound of children's laughter, something he hadn't heard in his home for months. It was almost too much to bear. Inside, bright murals covered the walls, painted rainbows, animals, and children's handprints. He could hear voices from down the hallway, soft, patient, kind. He followed the sound, and then he saw her. Mary Jackson, kneeling beside a small boy in a wheelchair, showing him how to hold a crayon. Her hair tied back loosely, her eyes calm, her smile exactly as he remembered, warm enough to melt the coldest room. He froze in the doorway, unable to speak. Time stopped. The boy in the wheelchair laughed suddenly, pointing at his drawing. Mary clapped her hands. "That's wonderful, honey. You did it." Her voice, it was the same tone that once healed his son's. Anthony's throat tightened. He had prepared so many words in his head, apologies, confessions, promises, but now, not one would come. He just stood there, watching her from across the room, like a man staring at a miracle he didn't deserve. Mary turned slightly, sensing someone behind her. When her eyes met his, her smile faltered. The room seemed to grow still. For a long, breathless moment, they just looked at each other. The distance between them felt heavier than all the months that had passed. Finally, she stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Morrison," she whispered, her voice trembling but controlled. "Why are you here?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He tried again, voice breaking. "Because I need to tell you something." She waited, silent, her eyes guarded. "You were right," he said softly. "About everything." Her eyes softened for a brief second. Then she looked away. "It's been months, Anthony." "I know." He took a step closer. "I thought I was helping them. I thought I was fixing things. But I was the problem." Tears glimmered in his eyes, unhidden this time. "They stopped laughing the day you left. They stopped being. And I can't live with that silence anymore." Mary's hands trembled slightly. She turned her gaze toward the children behind her. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because staying hurt more." Her voice cracked on the last word. "Every night I heard their cries in my dreams. Every day I prayed they'd find peace." Anthony took another step closer, his voice low, desperate. "They're trying, Mary. They're trying to speak. And I think they're waiting for you." Her eyes widened. "For me?" He nodded. "Their first word will be yours." Mary covered her mouth, a sob escaping before she could stop it. Her body shook with the weight of everything she'd carried alone for too long. Anthony didn't move closer. He knew she needed space. He just stood there, tears in his own eyes, letting her cry. And for the first time in months, both of them were silent. But this time it wasn't the silence of pain. It was the silence that comes right before a heart learns how to beat again. Outside, Charleston glowed in late afternoon gold. Children's laughter drifted through the open windows of the therapy center, and somewhere inside that warmth, the first spark of healing found its way back to the man who once thought love was a luxury. The next morning, Charleston woke to soft sunlight spilling across its rooftops. The rain was gone, replaced by that quiet kind of warmth that makes even the air feel hopeful. But inside the Morrison mansion, everything still moved carefully, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts that lingered in its corners. Anthony stood in the twins' nursery, holding a photo frame. The picture showed Mary smiling with the boys in her arms. That day in the garden when Daniel had laughed so hard, he'd almost fallen asleep in her lap. He traced her face with his thumb, remembering every detail, the braid over her shoulder, the way her eyes carried light. Behind him in the dark, the twins were sitting on the rug, playing with wooden blocks. They stacked them neatly, knocked them down, then started again, their game silent but strangely focused. He watched them quietly, unsure whether to speak or not. Every word felt like it might break something fragile. The last 24 hours replayed in his mind, finding Mary again, hearing her voice, feeling the flood of guilt and the fragile seed of forgiveness that followed. She hadn't promised to return, but he had felt something in her eyes, a hesitation, a thought left unfinished, something that said maybe, just maybe, she hadn't completely closed the door. He had gone home that night with one promise echoing in his mind. "They're waiting for you." The twins suddenly looked up at him, their eyes curious, as if sensing something new. Daniel reached for the toy piano in the corner, the one Mary used to play. He pressed a key. A soft note rang through the room, the first sound that wasn't silence in weeks. Anthony blinked, startled. David giggled, a tiny, breathy sound that faded almost as quickly as it came. But it was real. Anthony knelt down, heart racing. "Do that again," he whispered. The boys looked at each other, smiling in that wordless way only twins understand. Daniel pressed another key. David clapped. And for a brief, trembling moment, Anthony felt hope rise in his chest, like sunlight through clouds. He smiled through tears he didn't know he was shedding. "Good job, boys. Good job." That night, the house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence. This one was softer, like the pause between breaths. Anthony sat in the living room holding the note Mary had written when his phone buzzed. A message. He almost didn't look. Then he saw the name. Mary. His heart jumped. He opened it slowly. "The center's hosting a family open day tomorrow. If the boys are comfortable, bring them. It might help." He stared at the screen, barely breathing. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was hope. He typed back only 2 words. "We'll come." The next day. Charleston gleamed under the mid-morning sun. The streets were alive, vendors calling, children laughing, the smell of sea breeze mixing with roasted coffee. Anthony drove slowly, the twins in the back seat, dressed neatly in matching blue shirts. They looked nervous but curious, their eyes wide as they watched the world through the windows. When they reached St. Clair's Therapy Center, Mary was already outside greeting families. She looked up as his car stopped at the curb. For a second she hesitated, then smiled, small and shy. He stepped out, opened the door for the twins, and the 3 of them stood before her. The moment felt fragile, like a heartbeat made of glass. "You came," she said softly. "You asked us to," Anthony replied, his voice thick with emotion. She crouched down to the twins' level, her eyes warm and gentle. "Hey, little ones," she whispered. "Do you remember me?" The boys just stared, uncertain, but watching. Mary smiled. "It's okay. You don't have to say anything. I've missed you." Her voice cracked on that last word. and she blinked fast, fighting the tears. Inside, the center was alive with laughter. Music played softly through the speakers. Children were painting, singing, playing instruments. The twins clung to their father's hand at first, overwhelmed by the noise. Then slowly, step by step, began to move toward the play area. Mary stayed close, guiding them gently. She handed David a crayon and placed Daniel's hand over a small drum. "You can make sound," she said quietly. "It's okay to be loud sometimes." Daniel hesitated, then hit the drum lightly. A soft thump filled the air. David smiled, then scribbled something with the crayon. Mary clapped her hands gently. "That's perfect." Anthony stood a few feet away, watching. Every word, every gesture, every spark of joy she gave them felt like watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. Hours passed. The event wound down. Families left one by one, laughter echoing down the halls. The twins were sitting together at a small table, drawing stick figures, 3 of them, hand in hand. Mary leaned over, smiling softly. "Who's that?" Daniel pointed at the smallest figure, then the middle one. David pointed at the tallest. Mary's breath caught. "Is that me?" Neither boy spoke, but their smiles said enough. Anthony walked closer, kneeling beside them. "They drew you," he whispered. Mary looked at him, her eyes glassy, her lips trembling. "I never stopped praying for them." "And they never stopped waiting for you," he said gently. For a moment, neither spoke. Then a sound cut through the quiet. A small, fragile voice. "Ma." Mary froze. The sound had come from Daniel. His lips trembled, his eyes locked on hers. "Ma," he said again, louder this time. David turned, face lighting up, and echoed, "Ma!" Time stopped. Mary gasped, a sob tearing from her chest. Her hands flew to her mouth as she dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Anthony couldn't move. He just stared, every emotion he'd ever buried flooding to the surface at once. Shock, joy, guilt, wonder. Mary reached for them, and the twins threw their arms around her, giggling through tears of their own. Their small voices filled the room, rough and imperfect but alive. Alive in a way silence could never be. The staff stopped what they were doing. Some clapped, others wiped tears. Even strangers felt the weight of what they'd just witnessed. Anthony sank to one knee beside them, his vision blurring. Mary turned to him, her face shining with tears. "They spoke," she whispered, barely able to say the words. He nodded, voice breaking. "They said your name." The 4 of them stayed there, father, maid, and children, bound together by a moment that felt larger than life itself. Outside, the bells of Charleston's old cathedral began to ring. Their sound drifted through the open window, mingling with laughter, with tears, with the music of a family finding its voice again. And for the first time in 6 long months, the Morrison mansion no longer felt cursed. It felt like home. Charleston slept under a velvet sky that night, its street lamps casting golden halos on the rain-dark cobblestones. But inside the Morrison mansion, no one slept. Anthony sat on the nursery floor, the twins nestled between him, still murmuring the sound that had changed everything, that one small word that broke 6 months of silence. "Ma. Ma." They kept whispering it, as if afraid it might disappear if they stopped. Anthony listened, tears drying slowly on his cheeks. Across the room, the toy piano gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Every note that came from it now felt like a heartbeat. He wanted to call her, to tell her what they had done, to make her hear it with her own ears, but he couldn't bring himself to break the holiness of the moment. So he simply whispered into the quiet, "They found you again, Mary, and I swear I'll never lose you this time." The next morning, Charleston's sunrise painted the water gold. Anthony stood on the terrace, a mug of untouched coffee in his hand, watching gulls glide above the harbor. Behind him, laughter drifted faintly through the hallway, tiny giggles, hesitant but real. The twins were awake. He smiled, soft and incredulous, as if afraid to breathe too loudly and wake from a dream. For 6 months, silence had been the language of this house. Now it spoke laughter again. He turned as the housekeeper entered, her eyes wide with tears. "Sir, I heard them." Anthony nodded, voice shaking. "They said her name." She pressed a hand to her mouth. "Miss Mary." "Yes. And I think they need to see her again." He set down the mug and reached for his phone. Her number was still there. He'd saved it months ago but never dialed. His thumb hovered over the screen. He hesitated, then pressed call. The line rang once, twice. "Hello?" Her voice, steady, warm, familiar. Anthony exhaled shakily. "Mary." They spoke. A long pause, then a soft gasp. "What did they say?" "Your name." Silence again, this time filled with tears neither of them tried to hide. "I'm coming," she whispered. Later that morning. The mansion felt different the moment she stepped inside. The sunlight through the tall windows seemed warmer, the air lighter. Mary paused at the threshold, eyes wide as if entering a dream she never thought she'd revisit. The twins saw her first. Daniel froze. David blinked once, and then both ran. "Ma!" Their voices echoed up the marble staircase. Mary dropped to her knees, arms open, catching them both in an embrace so fierce it pulled the breath from her chest. She buried her face in their hair, laughing and sobbing at the same time. "Oh, my babies. I'm here. I'm right here." Anthony stood a few steps away, every muscle in his body trembling with emotion. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, but nothing prepared him for what it looked like, for what it felt like, to see her back in their arms. "I almost forgot what it sounded like," he said softly. Mary looked up, eyes glistening. "That sound saved me too." They sat together in the living room, the twins between them drawing on paper with crayons, while the two adults talked quietly. Anthony leaned forward, elbows on his knees, searching for words. "I don't know where to begin. I owe you more than an apology." "You don't owe me anything," Mary said gently. "They needed time, and so did you." "But I let pride silence this house," he said. "I turned love into control. I won't make that mistake again." Mary smiled faintly. "Then don't. Just promise you'll never let fear raise them." He nodded, eyes locked on hers. "I promise." The twins looked up at that moment as if they understood. Daniel reached for Mary's hand. David placed his tiny palm over his father's. 3 hands, one fragile chain of forgiveness. Evening. They took a walk through the garden, the same garden where Mary used to sing. The magnolia trees swayed softly in the breeze, petals drifting like snow across the grass. The twins toddled ahead, chasing butterflies, their laughter rising and falling like music. Anthony watched Mary from a distance, the way the sunlight touched her face, the way her presence seemed to breathe color back into everything. "It's strange," he said quietly. "For months I tried to fill this house with experts. None of them brought it back to life." "Because it was never about fixing," she replied. "It was about feeling." They stopped beneath the biggest tree, the one that still bore the faint carvings the twins had made with her help. Crooked hearts and messy letters. Mary traced them with her fingertips. "They remembered me through silence," she said softly. "Children remember love, even when words fail." Anthony swallowed hard, emotion catching in his throat. "I remembered you through regret." She looked at him, eyes gentle. "And what about now?" He hesitated, then smiled. "Now, I remember you through hope." Mary's lips trembled into a smile, and for a moment the air between them felt lighter than it had in years. Later that night, back inside, the twins were asleep. Mary stood in the doorway, watching their small chests rise and fall in unison. Anthony joined her, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want this to be temporary," he said. "Not for them, not for us." She turned to him slowly, uncertain. "Let me help you continue your work," he said quickly. "The center, the children, you shouldn't have to do that alone. Let me fund it, expand it. You've done more for healing than any doctor ever could." She blinked, stunned. "You'd do that?" "It's the least I can do." He looked at the twins, then back at her. "Maybe this is how I make things right, by building something that keeps your kind of love alive." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "Then promise me one thing," she whispered. "Promise you'll never forget what truly healed them." "I won't," he said. "It wasn't medicine. It was you." Mary looked away, blushing faintly. "Not me. It was love. You just had to remember how to give it." They stood there side by side, watching over the children who'd once known only silence. Outside, the city of Charleston glittered beneath the stars. From somewhere down the street, a church bell rang softly, 3 chimes that echoed through the night like a blessing. Anthony reached out, gently taking her hand. She didn't pull away. For a long, quiet moment, they said nothing. There was no need. Every sound they needed was already alive again, in the soft breathing of the twins, in the rustle of magnolia leaves, in the steady rhythm of forgiveness finding its home. The next morning, sunlight spilled softly through the wide Charleston windows, painting the nursery in gold. The twins were still asleep, their small faces turned toward the light. Mary stood by the window, one hand resting on the curtain, watching the city wake up beneath a sky washed clean. For the first time in months, she felt peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because something broken had finally begun to heal. Anthony entered quietly, 2 cups of tea in his hands. He handed one to her without speaking. Their fingers brushed, and both froze for a heartbeat before looking away. "They slept peacefully," she said softly. "They haven't done that since you left," he replied. Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was warm, gentle, like 2 people finally learning how to breathe the same air again. Mary glanced toward the twins, then at him. "Do you ever think," she said slowly, "that some people come into our lives not to stay forever, but to remind us how to feel again?" Anthony studied her face. "Maybe. But what if they're meant to stay, and we're just too afraid to believe it?" She smiled faintly, but didn't answer. Later that day, the 2 of them sat in the garden while the twins played in the grass, laughing as bubbles drifted through the air. It was one of those quiet Charleston afternoons when even the ocean seemed to hold its breath. Mary watched the boys chase the bubbles, her eyes glimmering with joy, and something else, something distant. Anthony noticed. "You look sad," he said softly. "I'm not sad," she whispered. "Just remembering." "Remembering what?" She hesitated. Then she set her teacup down and folded her hands in her lap. Her voice lowered, trembling slightly. "I had a son once." Anthony froze. The words hit him like cold water. Mary kept her eyes on the ground, the confession spilling out in fragile pieces. "His name was Isaiah. He was 5. Her voice cracked and she swallowed hard. "He was born with a heart defect. The doctors said he wouldn't live past 4. But he was strong, stronger than I ever was. He laughed through pain. He danced through the fear." Anthony's eyes softened, tears already building. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Mary looked toward the horizon, her gaze far away. "One night during a storm he asked me to sing to him. It was the same lullaby I used with the twins. He said it made the thunder sound softer." Her lips trembled. "When I woke up the next morning, he was gone." Her voice broke. Anthony's breath caught. He leaned forward, instinctively reaching for her hand. She didn't pull away this time. "After that," she whispered, "I couldn't go back to my old life. I left everything. I thought if I helped other children smile, maybe it would hurt less." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "That's why I took this job. When I saw your twins, when I saw how silent they were, I saw my Isaiah in them." Her words hit him deep in the chest, piercing through every layer of pride and guilt he'd carried. For a long moment he couldn't speak. Finally, he whispered, "You didn't just heal them, Mary. You healed me." The twins ran through the garden, their laughter echoing across the lawn. Anthony and Mary sat beneath the magnolia tree, the same one where the carvings still marked time. The wind carried the scent of the sea, and far beyond the mansion, the faint bells of Charleston's harbor rang. Anthony turned to her quietly. "You should have never had to carry that alone." Mary shook her head. Some pain you don't share because people don't understand it. They tell you to move on, to be strong, to let go. But how do you let go of the person who taught you how to love? Anthony's eyes glistened. Maybe you don't. Maybe you just love others harder in their memory. She looked at him, and something shifted between them. Not romance, not obligation, but something deeper. A quiet recognition. Two people who understood loss. When the twins said my name, she whispered, for a second, I felt like Isaiah was here, as if his voice came through them. Anthony smiled, tears streaking down his face. Then maybe he was. Maybe that was his gift to you, to all of us. The mansion glowed with lamplight. The twins were asleep again, small smiles still lingering on their faces. Mary tucked them in, brushing a stray curl from David's forehead. Anthony watched from the doorway, arms folded loosely, his eyes full of gratitude. You've given them more than anyone ever could, he said quietly. Mary turned, her expression tender. They gave me a reason to keep living. He stepped into the room, lowering his voice. You don't have to go back to the center tomorrow. She blinked. What do you mean? Stay. Not as staff, not as a maid. Stay because you belong here. Mary's breath caught. Anthony. I'm not asking you to give up your purpose, he said. I'm asking you to share it with us. Help me make this home what it was meant to be, a place of love, not loneliness. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief. If I stay, she whispered, promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll never let them forget how far they've come. Promise you'll keep listening, even when it's quiet. Anthony nodded. I will. I swear it. They stood there for a moment, the lullaby of the sea faint in the distance, the hum of Charleston crickets drifting through the window. Anthony extended his hand slowly. Mary hesitated, then took it. Then it's settled, he said softly. And in that simple gesture, an unspoken peace settled between them, the kind of peace that comes only when grief finally meets understanding. Outside, Charleston shimmered under moonlight. The magnolia leaves rustled gently, and for the first time since her son's passing, Mary felt something inside her unclench. Not everything broken stays broken. Sometimes love doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. As she turned toward the twins' room one last time, she smiled through tears and whispered, Good night, Isaiah. Thank you for leading me here. And somewhere deep inside that quiet mansion, love answered back, not in words, but in peace. Morning arrived softly over Charleston, painting the harbor in shades of amber and rose. The smell of magnolia drifted through open windows, mingling with the faint sound of waves against the shore. Inside the Morrison mansion, something had shifted, not in the walls but in the air. Where silence once ruled, now laughter roamed free. The twins were in the playroom, stacking wooden blocks, while Mary hummed a tune nearby. Anthony watched from the doorway, arms crossed, an unfamiliar calm on his face. He had spent months trying to fill this house with experts and therapy equipment, yet it had taken one woman, one soul with quiet faith, to bring it back to life. He didn't speak. He didn't want to break the moment. Daniel looked up, eyes bright, and lifted a block toward Mary. Hi, he said softly. Her breath caught. It wasn't just a sound this time. It was a word. A new one. David giggled, clapping his hands. Hi. Mary's eyes filled instantly with tears. She crouched beside them, voice trembling. Yes, sweetheart. That's right. Hi. Anthony's chest tightened, the emotion too heavy to hold. He pressed his palm against the doorframe, steadying himself. Every day since her return had been a step. Small, miraculous steps towards something he once thought impossible. Later that afternoon, the mansion buzzed with quiet activity. The housekeeper had brought flowers into the foyer. The scent of jasmine filled the halls. Anthony stood by the large window in his office, staring out at the sea. He had made a decision. He picked up the phone and called his assistant. I want you to cancel all my meetings for the next 2 weeks. Sir? All of them. No exceptions. There was a pause. May I ask why? Anthony smiled faintly. Because for the first time, I have something worth staying home for. When he returned downstairs, the twins were playing outside with Mary. The scene looked almost surreal. Sunlight filtering through the magnolia trees, bubbles floating through the air, laughter tumbling like music. He stood there for a while, just watching. Mary looked up and noticed him. "You're supposed to be working," she teased lightly. He walked closer, hands in his pockets. "I am working, just not on business anymore." She tilted her head, curious. "Then what are you working on?" "Rebuilding what I broke." Mary's smile faltered. There was sincerity in his voice, not the polished kind of a man used to boardrooms, but the fragile, human kind that comes after loss. "You already have," she said gently. "They're healing." "Not just them," he murmured. "All of us." For a while they just stood there, the golden Charleston sun reflecting in the twins' eyes as they ran across the grass, free and fearless. That evening, dinner felt different now. The long mahogany table that once seated silence now carried laughter and conversation. Mary helped the twins with their plates, while Anthony poured juice into their cups, smiling when Daniel reached for the spoon by himself. "Look, Dad," the boy said proudly, his words still a little slurred but perfectly clear. Anthony's hand froze mid-air. It was the first time his son had called him Dad out loud. He blinked hard, struggling not to cry. "I see you, champ," he said, voice thick. "That's perfect." Mary's eyes glistened as she watched him. For the first time, she saw him not as the man who had lost everything, but as a father who had finally learned how to love without fear. After dinner, the twins ran upstairs with their toys. Mary began clearing the table, but Anthony gently took the tray from her hands. "Let me." "You don't have to." They worked side by side in quiet rhythm. Plates, glasses, silverware. Every small motion felt like another piece of healing falling into place. When the last plate was stacked, Anthony leaned against the counter. "You once told me they'd speak when they felt safe again." Mary nodded softly. "I remember." "Then I guess safety doesn't come from money or walls." "No," she said, smiling. "It comes from love." He looked at her for a long time. "You've given us that." Mary shook her head. "No, Anthony. You learned to give it yourself. I just reminded you how." Later that night, the twins were asleep, their small chests rising and falling beneath the soft glow of the night lamp. Anthony stood by the door, whispering goodnight before stepping out into the quiet hallway. He found Mary in the living room, folding the twins' drawings into a small scrapbook. On the table lay crayons, scissors, and a few colored papers. "You're keeping all of these?" he asked, smiling. "Of course," she said. "Every line tells a story." She held up one of the drawings. It showed 4 stick figures holding hands under a sun. 3 were smiling, and 1 had tears falling from its eyes. "That was the first drawing they made after I left," she said quietly. "The one crying was you." Anthony's throat tightened. He reached out and gently took the drawing from her hands. "And now?" he asked. "Who would be crying now?" Mary looked at him, long, steady, full of meaning. "No one," she whispered. Something flickered between them, not romance, but reverence. A deep gratitude that words couldn't touch. He nodded slowly. "Good." Then he reached into his pocket and placed an envelope on the table. "What's this?" she asked. "A donation," he said. "For the therapy center. Enough to rebuild it, expand it, and make it free for families who can't afford help." Mary's hand flew to her mouth. "Anthony, this is too much." "It's not enough," he said softly, "because there are children out there like our boys, and people like you who can reach them. I want to be part of that." Tears shimmered in her eyes again. "You already are." They sat together in silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the soft hum of Charleston's night outside. It wasn't the silence of grief anymore. It was the kind that follows peace. Mary exhaled slowly, smiling through tears. "Do you hear that?" Anthony tilted his head. "What?" "The house," she said softly. "It's breathing again." He looked around, at the glowing lamps, the drawings, the faint laughter echoing from down the hall, and realized she was right. For the first time in forever, the house felt alive. He nodded, eyes full of gratitude. "Then I'll never let it go silent again." Mary smiled, whispering like a prayer. "Then you've already kept your promise." Outside, Charleston slept peacefully beneath a silver moon. The ocean murmured softly against the shore, the magnolia trees swayed, and within the Morrison mansion, love settled finally into its rightful place. Not loud, not perfect, but whole. And as Anthony turned out the lights that night, he paused at the doorway one last time, listening. Through the stillness came a faint sound from the twins' room, two small voices whispering the lullaby Mary once sang. Anthony closed his eyes, smiling. "Good night, my boys," he whispered. "Good night, Mary." And for the first time in 6 long months, every sound in that house meant home. Morning dawned over Charleston like a quiet promise. Sunlight spilled through the city's iron-wrought balconies, brushing the cobblestone streets with gold. The waves along the harbor moved slowly, rhythmically, as if the whole city was breathing in peace again. Inside the Morrison mansion, there was movement, not the sterile bustle of maids and managers that once filled its halls, but the gentle rhythm of a home alive with purpose. Mary stood by the kitchen counter, helping the twins pack art supplies into small paper bags. Each had drawn a red heart on the front. "Are you nervous?" she asked with a smile. Daniel shook his head, serious. "Daddy said we're helping people today," David added. "We're going to show them the pictures." Anthony entered just then, adjusting the cuff of his tailored grey suit. He looked sharp, composed, but his eyes, softer now, carried something they hadn't before. "Are my artists ready?" he asked. The twins nodded eagerly. Mary looked up at him. "Are you ready?" He hesitated for half a second, then smiled faintly. "I've faced investors, reporters, and billion-dollar negotiations, but this might be the first time I'm actually afraid." Mary laughed softly. "Good. That means you're about to do something that matters." A few hours later, the Charleston Grand Hall gleamed beneath its crystal chandeliers. Rows of chairs lined the polished floor, filled with business leaders, journalists, and philanthropists. It was the annual Hope for Tomorrow charity gala, a night when the wealthy came to parade generosity like jewelry. But this year would be different. Anthony Morrison had donated millions before, but tonight he hadn't come as a donor. He'd come as a father, and as a man who had finally learned what love really meant. Mary stood backstage with the twins, watching him step up to the podium. Her heart raced. She wasn't supposed to be there, but he'd insisted. "This story isn't mine alone," he had told her. "It's ours." Now she could barely breathe. The hall quieted. Spotlights bathed him in gold. Anthony cleared his throat, his voice calm but weighted with emotion. 6 months ago, I stood in this same room and gave a speech about innovation, about business, about legacy. I spoke of numbers, of wealth, of progress. He paused, looking down for a moment. But what I didn't realize then was that none of it meant anything if the people you love can't hear your heart. A murmur spread through the crowd, surprise, curiosity. "For years," he continued, "I thought my purpose was to build empires, but I lost something greater in the process. I lost connection." He looked toward the back of the room, where Mary stood half hidden behind the curtain. "Until one woman taught me what true healing looks like." Mary's breath caught. "Her name," he said, voice trembling slightly, "is Mary Jackson." The audience turned. Cameras flashed. "I met her when she came to work for me, not as a therapist, not as a doctor, but as a maid. And yet, she did what all my resources, all my power, could not. She gave my sons their voice back." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman near the front dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "She taught me that love doesn't wear a title," Anthony said softly. "It serves quietly, patiently, until the impossible happens." He gestured toward the wings. "Mary, would you join me?" Mary froze, eyes wide. The twins tugged her hands excitedly. "Go, Ma," David whispered. Her legs felt weak as she stepped into the light. Applause erupted, growing louder with each step she took. Anthony reached out his hand. She hesitated, then took it. The warmth between them was undeniable. Not romantic, but holy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I'd like to introduce the real reason I'm standing here tonight, the woman who reminded me that humanity is worth more than every fortune combined." He turned toward her. "And if you'll allow me, Mary, I'd like to make this official." He nodded to a staff member at the side of the stage. A large banner unfurled behind them, bold white letters against navy blue. "The Isaiah Foundation, for Children's Healing and Hope." Mary gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth. The crowd erupted again, louder this time. "I started a foundation in your son's name," Anthony said quietly, voice trembling. "You once told me that helping other children made the pain hurt less. Now you'll never have to do it alone." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Anthony, how did you—" "You told me his name," he said simply, "and I listened." The twins ran up the stage then, holding their drawings. Each picture showed the four of them, the twins, Mary and Anthony, standing under a shining sun, smiling. They handed them to Mary proudly. "This one's for Isaiah," Daniel said softly. "And for you," added David. The audience stood, not out of politeness, but out of reverence. Applause thundered, echoing off the walls like a heartbeat. Mary wept openly now, the drawings pressed against her chest. Anthony placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You didn't just save my children," he said. "You saved me." She turned to him, tears still falling, and whispered, "And you reminded me that miracles don't end where pain begins." The gala had ended, but the echo of applause still lingered in the halls. Outside, the Charleston air was cool and sweet. Mary stood on the balcony, overlooking the city lights that shimmered like a sea of stars. She held one of the drawings in her hands, her fingers tracing the crayon lines. Anthony joined her quietly, 2 glasses of sparkling juice in hand. "You did it," he said. "No," she smiled. "We did." They stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of waves against the pier. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think Isaiah's story ended the night he died. But tonight, I realized it just changed chapters." Anthony nodded slowly. "His name will live forever, through every child we help." Mary turned to him, eyes shining under the city glow. "Thank you for giving my pain a purpose." He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable but tender. "You gave me my soul back. This was the least I could do." Down below, a group of photographers were packing up their cameras. One turned, noticing them on the balcony, and snapped a picture. The image would later make headlines: "Billionaire honors former maid in emotional gala. A story of faith, loss, and love reborn." But for the 2 people standing there, none of that mattered. The night was theirs. The peace was real. And somewhere deep within that quiet city, a little boy's name, Isaiah, was whispered once more in gratitude by the wind that carried miracles. Dawn crept over Charleston in soft shades of gold and rose. The city was quiet, washed in peace, the kind that only comes after a long storm. Seagulls glided over the harbor, their calls echoing faintly in the distance, and the first light of morning spilled gently through the glass walls of the Morrison mansion. Inside, the world felt different. The air carried warmth now, laughter from the twins' room, the smell of pancakes drifting from the kitchen, and the sound of Mary's voice humming low under her breath. Anthony stood by the balcony, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise above the water. He could see the reflection of the waves glinting like hope itself. 6 months ago, he would have been standing there alone, staring at numbers on a screen, drowning in silence. Now, behind him, he could hear life, and he'd never take it for granted again. A few hours later, the mansion buzzed softly with preparation. Today was the official opening of the Isaiah Foundation for Children's Healing and Hope. Volunteers moved through the house arranging flowers, adjusting banners, and placing framed photos on tables, one of them of Isaiah, smiling beside a mural of handprints. Anthony watched as the twins ran through the hallway, dressed in small matching suits, their laughter echoing. Mary followed behind, straightening their collars, smiling with that calm grace that seemed to steady everyone around her. "You're going to make me cry before the guests even arrive," Anthony said, chuckling. "Then we're already off to a good start," Mary teased gently. She adjusted one of the boys' ties, then looked around the transformed mansion. Every wall, every hallway seemed to hum with new life. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's yours too," he said softly. "This was never just my home. You gave it its heart back." She smiled, blinking fast. "And you gave love a place to stay." Later that afternoon, the front gates opened to a stream of visitors, families, children, doctors, community members, and reporters. But it didn't feel like a press event. It felt like something sacred, a homecoming. Mary greeted families as they arrived, hugging mothers, laughing with children. The twins proudly handed out flyers that said, "Every child deserves to be heard." Anthony watched her from across the room, his chest swelling with quiet pride. He had spent years being applauded for wealth, but this, seeing her light up the lives of others, was the first time he'd felt worthy of the applause. When everyone had gathered, Anthony stepped forward to speak. He didn't stand behind a podium this time, just in the middle of the crowd, at eye level with everyone. "When I built this mansion," he began, "I thought I was building a legacy, but a legacy without love is just a monument to ego." He paused, scanning the faces before him, mothers holding children, fathers wiping their eyes, Mary standing quietly near the twins. "It took 2 small boys and 1 extraordinary woman to show me what real wealth looks like: laughter, healing, and grace." He turned to the plaque unveiled at the entrance, engraved with gold letters, "The Isaiah Foundation. Founded in memory of love that never dies." Anthony's voice caught. "This foundation isn't about me. It's about the people who remind us that miracles aren't found in labs or bank accounts. They're found in hearts like hers." He looked directly at Mary. The crowd followed his gaze, applauding softly. She pressed a hand to her chest, eyes shining with tears. The event was over. The guests had left. But the house still glowed with candlelight and laughter. The twins had fallen asleep on the couch, tiny fingers still clutching the ribbons from the ceremony. Mary stood by the window, gazing at the city lights reflecting on the water. Anthony walked in quietly, holding 2 cups of tea. He handed her one. "You've been quiet," he said softly. She smiled. "Just thinking. About how something so broken can still become something beautiful." Anthony followed her gaze out the window. Charleston shimmered below them, peaceful, whole. "Maybe that's how God works," he said quietly. "He doesn't erase pain. He redeems it." Mary looked at him, tears brimming again. "Then I guess he redeemed both of us." They stood together, the golden lamplight washing over them, the hum of crickets outside blending with the soft breathing of the twins asleep behind them. The house had fallen silent again, but it wasn't the silence of loss anymore. It was the soft, living silence of peace. Anthony walked through the hallways, stopping at the twins' room. They were fast asleep, their faces calm and content. Between them sat the small wooden box where Mary's note used to rest. Now inside it lay something new, a drawing of 4 figures holding hands, with a 5th one drawn above them in the sky. The label, written in David's uneven handwriting, said, "Our family," and Isaiah. Anthony's vision blurred. He knelt beside the bed, brushing a hand through his son's hair. "Thank you, my boys," he whispered. "You taught me what love sounds like." He looked up, his eyes falling on the stars through the window. "And thank you, Isaiah," he murmured, "for sending her to us." Mary found him there minutes later, the moonlight spilling across the floor. She didn't say anything, just knelt beside him, placing her hand over his. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The twins stirred slightly, murmuring in their sleep, and both adults smiled. Mary whispered, "You kept your promise. They're safe now." Anthony nodded. "Because of you." She smiled, tears glistening in the silver light. Because of us. The next morning, Charleston woke to a new day, the sound of waves mingling with church bells. The Morrison mansion stood tall and bright, not as a symbol of power, but of peace. In the garden, Mary sat on a bench watching the twins chase butterflies while Anthony read from a book under the magnolia tree. Every laugh, every shout, every sound felt like music. At one point, Daniel ran up to her, tugging her sleeve. "Ma, can we go to the beach later?" Mary smiled wide. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll all go." She looked toward Anthony, who was already watching her, smiling. It wasn't a look of possession, but of gratitude, the kind that says thank you for saving my world. As the sun climbed higher over Charleston, a soft breeze rippled through the magnolia leaves, carrying the scent of the sea and the echo of laughter. And somewhere in that golden morning light, Mary's voice rose in a familiar tune, the lullaby she once sang to heal broken hearts. This time, she sang it not to calm sorrow, but to celebrate joy. Anthony closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. He didn't need to say a word, because in that melody, in that moment, in that home, every prayer had already been answered. Sometimes love doesn't need to be found. It just needs to be remembered.